Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our Coffee and Chat web series. My name is Richard Kalordi. I'm the Marketing Manager at HLB Manjudd in Perth. And this morning, it's my pleasure to welcome Guy Brandon, the Tax Consulting Partner at HLB Manjudd, to talk about the frequently asked questions around the JobKeeper Payment Program. Guy and the team at HLB have been working very hard over the last couple of months, working closely with clients around the various government stimulus packages, and the JobKeeper program is one of the highest priorities at the moment for clients. Guy, welcome this morning.
Thanks, Richard, and thank you for everyone who've logged into a webinar today. First for me, and one of the first for the firm, and it's a different way to do business, and we're all changing out there, and hopefully we'll pull some of these things into our, once we're all over the COVID and back into hopefully the real world.
Thanks, Guy. Okay, so I'm going to jump right in. Guy, today is the 6th of May. Why is today a significant day for the JobKeeper Payment Program?
Well, 6th of May is probably important insofar as it's only two days to go to the 8th of May, and that's probably the most critical date that we have at this time for those people that are wanting to register or make payments for their eligible employees for the first 2 fortnights of April. But before we go on to that, it was interesting when I woke up this morning and just listening to the radio, there was a few things that sort of came out this morning, which was interesting. It's amazing how many things have been chopping and changing around. Listening to the Treasurer, Josh Frydenberg, mentioning today that he was saying that so far 728,000 entities or businesses have actually already enrolled for the JobKeeper program, which he said was sort of equated to about 4.7 million workers out there. Having said that, looking at the business news as well, they were saying that in WA, they reckon that it was only 30% of the businesses that had registered, so which is one of the lowest states. So it probably shows how things have been operating with a lot of the things that are happening with the state government. But a couple of other main points from what the Treasurer was talking about this morning was that, one is that there's going to be no broadening of the JobKeeper scheme. So for people that after they've done all their testing can't meet those tests or never meet those tests, well then any other way they might be able to get into the scheme looks like that's not going to be broadened. So we've got the rulings that we've got, but also too, it sounds like he's got extra protection at the moment. So it just shows you the emotions that are running high out there for people that haven't been able to satisfy the tests or don't think they're going to satisfy the tests. So as I said, just going back, why is 6 important? We're just running out of time for the people who haven't been able to determine their turnover tests to actually start to make sure they've got those locked down. Secondly, to make the necessary payments for those 2 April fortnights, and also which it seems to have, it was only when we started to finalise the planning for this, is realising that by Sunday the 10th of May is actually the first of the fortnights for May, and payments have got to be made by then for anyone that wants to, who haven't been able to deal with it, and make sure that they've actually got those payments there for the 10th of May. That sort of caught up on us.
Okay, I'm going to start with many questions have already been pre-submitted. If attendees do have particular questions they would like to ask this morning, you can do so via the Q&A panel at the bottom of your screen. We will try and get to them. Guy, the first question I've got is, can I get the JobKeeper if I'm not registered for GST?
Actually, if you don't mind, just before we get there, so we're sort of running, sort of timing at the moment, is that we're sort of, with the 6th going to the 8th and the 10th, there's also too from there is what's next actually, before some of the questions, and really what's happening between, so the 8th and 10th of May through to the 31st of May. And from that, the next main date after that's on the 24th of May, which is the payments that need to be made for the eligible employees for that 2nd fortnight in May. And then once we get to the 31st of May, and this is, unfortunately, this date's sort of been thrown a few people out, is that with some of the information that you read, they keep talking about, oh, you've got to enrol for, for the April, for May, by the 31st of May. But then the idea of when that initial payment's got to be made for those first 2 April fortnights seems to fall, a few paragraphs down or a paragraph down, and some people might have been missing out on that. So the 31st is there really just to finalise the enrolments, identify the employees, and also too for the monthly business declaration, effectively for the April period. But just to reiterate, that 8th of May is absolutely critical if you want to make the payments for the 2 fortnights for April. So getting into the questions, and there's been a number. Back to the questions, and it's been amazing. This has been going since 30th of March, and we were wondering how many people, how many questions we would have, and it's just been considerable. So it just shows you still the complexity of the legislation and difficulties that people are finding. So, do you need to be registered for GST? I think this question's come out because of the way that the legislation or the rules have been drafted, and they revolved around the reduction in turnover being related to current GST turnover and projected GST turnover. You don't need to be registered for GST to get into the JobKeeper scheme. So that's a bit of a furphy there. There are some people out there that won't be registered for GST for a couple of reasons. One, because they don't meet the necessary threshold for the normal GST registration, and it's not worth their while to actually do that from a compliance point of view and the costs involved. And also too, is that if people, a number of businesses, suppliers that they make are GST-free suppliers or all input tax suppliers, mostly the GST-free suppliers in this instance here, and they've again decided from a compliance perspective they don't need to register for GST. So you don't need to be registered for GST to get into the scheme. Having said that, you've got to meet certain criteria. So, you've got to have been operating a business or be a not-for-profit from on the 1st of March 2020. You've got to have employed one eligible employee on that date. And those employees have still got to be on your books. And one of the biggest areas here is that you've actually had a reduction in turnover, depending on the size of the business. But for most of the people that we're talking about today, will either be a reduction of 30% or for not-for-profits being 15%. So yeah, the confusion about whether or not you need to register for GST or not is more so is how the definitions have been for actual turnover.
Okay. On to our next question. What happens if I was on holiday for all of March 2019? How does the comparison under the basic test work?
I think about holidays, it's a different landscape. And it was interesting today, you're sort of hearing now, like if we had this webinar a week or so ago or 2 weeks ago, it might have been a completely different webinar. Today, all we're hearing now is, well, how are we going to get back to work? What are we going to do with regards to actually moving around? And people are talking about how we can actually go away on holidays and things like that. So there's positivity out there, which is good. So I think that it depends on where this question's come from and who the questions have been asked by. Is that if we're saying that someone's been away on holidays for in March 2019, I'll assume that the person is a sole trader and probably had a well-deserved holiday in March 2019. So there's a couple of things to work out whether or not you had a reduction. So as going back to the basic test, which is clearly the main test that's out there to determine the reduction in turnover, is that they would have either looked at their March, their projected current turnover for March 2020 versus March 2019. Of course, they didn't have any turnover during that, so they wouldn't be able to get in at that stage. Then they've also too got the opportunity to revisit, say, the projected turnover, GST turnover for April 2020 versus April 2019. And they might have been able to pass in that instance there. We don't have to just look at that March comparison. Also too, for the first 2 fortnights in April, they can look at April to June 2020 projected GST turnover compared to the current GST turnover for April to June 2019. Having said that, and also too, maybe depending on what happened after that person came back to work, then there could have been a time frame where there's a bit of a lag and they might not have had much turnover. So therefore, if you can't get into the basic tests, then you've got the opportunity to look at the alternative tests, and there's 7 alternative tests there. And one of those alternative tests is actually for sole traders and small partnerships. Clearly, there's difficulties when you've got people away or being ill. So in that situation there, depending on when in that first month they've come back from either being away or being sick, then you compare that particular first month after you've come back with the month that you're looking at. So if you're looking at April and they're away from March, so you'd be comparing April 20 versus April 19. If you're looking at the April to June 2020, then you would compare 3 times the April 19 compared to the April June 2020. And then if you still don't get into it, then just keep testing at other points down the track to try and get into the scheme.
Okay. Our next question comes from somebody who is watching this morning. Regarding government fee for service contracts, would these be excluded or excluded in the GST turnover test?
Well, we've got a number of not-for-profit clients, and we've been finding that this has been when people are sort of talking about it who are not involved in the sector, they go, well, it seems to be a bit unfair that they've only got 15% rather than a 30% reduction. And it's been amazing up until some changes over the last couple of weeks that some of the not-for-profits were struggling to actually get to that 15%, even though they were hurting. And clearly the government did see this was an issue. So what I think it was the 24th of April, if memory serves me, is that there were some changes that were announced. And one of the key changes for the not-for-profit area goes back to government payments and government schemes. So the opportunity for the not-for-profits is whether or not when they're calculating their current GST turnover and for the prior period or comparison period and the projected GST turnover for the period we're looking at, is they can either include for each of the periods or exclude from each of the periods the government services, the government funding, the payments that they receive for that, and they can choose whichever gives them the best outcome. So that's been a real benefit for the not-for-profits. So having said that, there's a couple of other things on that. Is that one, let's assume that it gives them the reduction that they're required to get into the JobKeeper scheme. Then from there is that within 7 days of making that irrevocable election, they have got to inform the commissioner, and I still haven't seen the exact form on that, but I think that will be coming out shortly. And then when there's the monthly declarations, and we'll talk about that more, and presumably there'll probably be a couple of questions on that later, is that you've got to treat your turnover for the month that you're reporting on and the projected turnover for the following month, that you've got to base that turnover on the election that you make. And also too, I think I mentioned there was a couple of other questions that came through. I think one was with regards to Lottery West and whether or not if anyone was getting funded by that. So when we're looking at if not-for-profits are getting funds from Lottery West, what you've got to look at is whether or not the people they're funding are either Australian government agencies or WA government agencies or local agencies. They're the ones that you can make the choice of whether or not to bring into the turnover or not. So they've got to be actually funded by government agencies. So critically is when you're trying to work out whether or not you can exclude them is based on where they fit and are they truly government agencies, and the websites generally, they set those up. I know the state government has a really good site with regards to what's a government agency.
Okay, thanks, Guy. The next question comes from a mining client within the firm. Are exploration companies entitled to claim JobKeeper?
Another big area for the practice, junior exploration entities, companies. I reckon the first 5 calls I got when this was first mooted were from junior explorers and whether or not I thought they would get in. I think when it first came out, was first announced, my sort of blanket view was, no, sorry, you can't, because of the reduction in turnover. Because sort of by their very nature, the junior explorers are not making supplies. Having said that, now is that, you know, since then we've had rules and amendments, 2 amendments to the rules. We've had alternative tests come out, and what I'll be doing is that this is very definition and legislative driven, and therefore do the tests, because you're never quite sure that you might get into it. So on the face of it, probably not, but certainly if there's been situations where you've maybe in the prior period, there might have been a sale of a tenement, or there might have been a sale of assets, and then those haven't actually occurred in the period that we're talking about, you know, in April or June, or even later down the track, might not have been there. Is that when you do the calculations, then there's that opportunity that you might get there. You might not get there for April, but you might get there for another month. I mean, you always test. If you can't get there, you don't have to wait for another month or another quarter. You can revisit it every fortnight. So, as a general rule, probably not, but it wouldn't stop me from doing the calculations. And you know, there was a piece in I think the West from Brad McVeigh, one of our partners, on Saturday, and he was saying, you know, this is one of those sort of critical areas with regards to junior explorers. And you know, it's one of those things, especially after what happened tomorrow, that it's clear from the Treasurer that they're actually not going to broaden the JobKeeper program. It's probably a time just to mention that JobKeeper program too is also important with some of the other areas with regards to the tenancies. And I know I wrote a piece on that a couple of weeks ago. And you know, the point is that if you can't get into the JobKeeper, then you might not get certain other benefits, especially when it comes to maybe some protections from the landlords out there.
Okay. Guy, if I don't meet any of the tests, can I apply to the Commissioner to see if we can do the calculation in another way?
We started talking about having this webinar a number of weeks ago, and I think if we had that webinar at that time, I would have said not quite petitioning your local member and petitioning the Commissioner. I think now, after the situation that we've heard this morning, is that if you can't get it now, then we've got to work within the rules that we currently have. I think that the question too is that is making sure that you've gone through every way that you can do your calculations. And you know, again, have you looked at March to March, April to April, June quarter to June quarter, all the alternative tests? But even I was having quite a lengthy conversation yesterday, is that prior to that law companion ruling coming out on the 4th, that Monday, is that we thought on certain days where some of our clients couldn't get the JobKeeper. And then when this draft ruling came out, and you look at some of the ways that the Commissioner is allowing now to determine what the current and projected GST turnover is, maybe you've given opportunities for some people who thought they might not get in because there's a different methodology of working out what comes into any particular period and what the value is of that. So it would have been great if we had that earlier, but we know that everyone's been running really hard to get this scheme going through. So again, I would just keep testing, and I'd certainly revisit or certainly visit if you haven't seen it yet, that draft ruling from the Commissioner.
Okay. Guy, our next question is a pre-registered question from an HLB Manjud client who is a small business owner. On the topic of pro rata long service leave and JobKeeper, are we allowed to have staff on long service leave with JobKeeper?
I think there's 2 parts to that question. I think the first issue, and I think, you know, certainly from my perspective, you know, being tax consulting partner, we've been very much looking at the tax side, but also too is that there's clearly been changes as part of this JobKeeper program of how to deal with the Fair Work Act, and there's been a number of changes there. And I'll certainly profess that I'm no expert on that whatsoever. That's why we've got an HR manager to do that assistance for us. So I think in the first instance, as part of this overall question, is to see where you're at with regards to fair work, and you're talking to your employees and making sure that everyone's on the same page, and you're acting within what the legislation allows for in that. So I would be, when we start talking about annual leave and long service leave for staff, I think that's the first part, the priority. Having said that, with regards to the other side, it really goes back to, have you, and this is where it's heading to, is that have you made the necessary payments for the JobKeeper for the fortnights? And we're talking about, let's say, the 2 fortnights in April. And this is this $1,500 per fortnight before tax. So really what you're looking at is, have you paid those funds? So effectively, and we'll get to the long service leave in a minute, that you've actually paid the $1,500, whatever tax that you've actually taken out of that, because there's generally going to be PAYG withholding to be taken out of that, but which is still included as that $1,500. But then also too is that you may have made payments with regards to salary sacrifice superannuation, or there might be other salary sacrifice arrangements that you've entered into, which have been agreed previously with the employees. So all of that's included as part of that $1,500 per fortnight before tax. So getting to that is that annual leave and long service leave will certainly be included in that. So if you're actually paying people long service leave and annual leave, those amounts will be included as part of that $1,500.
Guy, this is sorry.
Sorry, but it's just one of the other things too, and it's probably, again, I'm probably changing as this has progressed over the last few weeks, is that there really was a thought out there for the employees that they were going to be receiving $1,500 cash per fortnight. But I think there's a lot more information out there at the moment. They probably understand there's going to be tax taken out of it. But I would be, if you haven't had a chance to talk to your employees, they're still asking those questions, that would probably be still one of those questions that there's still a bit of confusion out there at the moment.
Okay. Guy, this next question is something that we've definitely heard before and has been covered quite extensively in the media. Mm. How will businesses that have had to close be able to pay employees upfront without their existing cash flow?
Yep. Also had a question a while ago, was that someone didn't actually agree with the methodology of the reimbursement, and even though they were still in business, and the question is, well, because of that, I wasn't going to go ahead with the program. Having said that, I think we certainly changed their mind, because I know that they've actually gone down that path. The idea of the people, and I think sitting here and helping people out, is that there are a lot of people out there that are really hurting. There are people that you're hearing they're having huge years, and all of a sudden their turnovers just dropped to zero. There have been businesses that have been, life savings have been put into them and been going for generations, and then they're struggling now. And the way that the legislation is at the moment, it really is on a reimbursement basis. So certainly my understanding of my readings is that the Treasury have been working very hard with the banks and financiers to say, look, there is going to be a time lag. We need to get the money into the economy. We need to help the employers to be able to support their employees. So my understanding is that the banks have been having hotlines to try and get to discuss with the people that haven't got the income, to try and find ways to support them with regards to that. They've agreed that they'll put all these matters to the front of the queue for anyone that's to do with JobKeeper. So I really hope for the people that haven't been able to find the funds at the moment to pay that, knowing that there's going to be a reimbursement down the track, that they need to do whatever they can with their banks. And I really hope that the banks do the right thing by the employees to keep going, because we'll get out of it, but it's how we get out of it's really critical. And I just wish all the best for all the people out there who are really, really battling at the moment, and also for the people who've actually had the virus. Sometimes we forget about them. We're more so talking about economics here, but yeah, so critical. We've got to try and help everyone to get through this.
The next question is from a sole trader with regards to monthly declarations dates and evidence requirements for JobKeeper. What are some key points around that, Guy?
That monthly declaration, so apart from the actual, have you got a reduction in turnover? That's the one that's been had the most amount of questions. So I think that's the fear. So even if I can get in, what happens down the track? What information am I giving you? And I think we've been a little bit fortunate in the last couple of days with some of the other information that's been coming through from the Commission that certainly allayed some of those fears. So getting back to the monthly declarations, it's probably slightly different for April. You know, that'll be done certainly by the 31st of May for those declarations. So what the declarations really are is that what's your current GST turnover for that period, so for April, and what was your projected GST turnover for May. Where the fear factor is this idea of, well, let's say I projected we might be getting to June and things might be opening up, and I thought my turnover was going to be zero or nominal, and therefore, and then things are opened up. Is this the information that's been provided is actually just giving further information so the government can see where things are going. Also, we're pretty naive to think that where there's a concern from the Commissioner that someone might not have been playing the game properly, well, and of course they're going to be able to use that. But don't think that if you actually have done your necessary calculations using your best endeavours, we can talk about that a bit further in a minute, and then something happens and your turnover is greater than what you expected, that turnover is greater than what you expected does not mean that you're going to be kicked out. So that's not fair. And there's an example within the compliance guide from the Commissioner, with an example saying that you had the particular person had this amount of projected income, projected turnover, and then they had projected turnover of current turnover in a couple of months' time considerably more because of things out of their control. And it was clear from that example, the Commission said, that is okay, you're still in it. There's this idea of, they're talking about as part of this declarations as well, your continued eligibility. Now, I think that's probably caused a fear as well, and it's a poor choice of term, is that there are certain times where you cannot be eligible anymore. And those are for companies that have gone into liquidation or provisional liquidators there, or for a sole trader, they've gone into bankruptcy. At that stage, they are no longer eligible. So the eligibility is the eligibility within parts of the Act. It's not that you've gone over your projected turnover because, fortunately, that you've had a benefit of increased turnover. And I must admit, I was saying to certain people out there, I thought we were going to be in this for a lot longer, and now there's this real let's get back to work, and we're losing $4 billion a week by not being at the office. So clearly people have made decisions in the last couple of weeks which hopefully their turnover will be greater than what they expected. That doesn't mean that they're going to be kicked out.
Okay. On to our next question. If based upon a projection, a company is eligible for JobKeeper and that projection is exceeded, what are the consequences?
That's sort of going back to the last question, this idea of what your projections were. I think there's a couple of points, additional points to that, is that you've got to make sure that when you're doing your calculations that you have got the necessary accounting information, the evidence is at the time that you're making those tests that you've actually got, and using your best endeavours. And the way the Commissioner looks at that is that if you're looking at suppliers, is that the way you're actually dealing with it or calculating it is that there's a more than likely chance that you're going to receive those suppliers, or more than likely chance that you're not going to receive those suppliers at that time. So when it comes to that draft compliance law companion, that was, I think it was on the 4th, or Monday this week, is that you've got to be mindful of how you actually deal with what's the GST turnover. It's probably the right time to talk about it, is that there is multiple ways to work out what turnover we're talking about. So it's usually, from a contractual perspective, or how that supply would be looked at normally, leaving aside the GST implications. But then, the Commissioner has clearly said that they know that in some instances that's going to be impractical. So there's other ways to actually deal with that. And then, so for those ones there, we're sort of looking at whether or not you're using on the accruals basis, or GST attribution, or if you're not registered for GST, on an income tax basis. So there's other ways that the Commissioner is allowing the entities to actually determine what their turnover is, and that's to work out not just what that supply is, the value of that supply, because that supply might be ongoing, and how that's going to be dealt with, and probably most critically is in what period that is, because there might be a view that that turnover should be in one period. It might be might be in March, or it might be in April, but there might be different ways. It could be treated as March, April, May, June, or October. So again, if you're struggling to get into the moment, or get into the JobKeeper at the moment, revisit how you've actually done the calculations, and as if people are looking for that ruling, if they want to send the information through to Richard, we'll certainly make sure we send out the necessary links to go from there, or we can certainly help going through that process.
Mm-hmm. Okay, on to a next question, which has been submitted by a registrant. What can an employer do if they do not have sufficient drop in income to be eligible in April, but their income drops further in, say, a later period?
Sort of a consistent theme. I think the first issue is that I would just retest anyway with the numbers that you've done, because, as I said, in the last couple of days, there's probably been a difference of how you can look at those basic tests for the April fortnights, and also too for the alternative tests. So having said that, if you run through the calculations again and you haven't been able to get into the JobKeeper at the moment, then we've really only today talking about the 2 April fortnights. We've got to, so now the next fortnight's 10th of May, and the next fortnight after that's the 24th of May. Well, then you can recalculate it. So you're looking at now, say the projected turnover for May compared to the current for May 2019, or still that April-June quarter. I would keep looking at it every fortnight, but that really brings up the situation, is that you've got to make sure that your accounting data, again, has always been, it needs to be as strong as possible, but the timing of getting that data in and actually running reports, people do it annually, hopefully, bring it back to quarter. Ultimately, you want to have, monthly reports. While this is happening and you haven't actually met the criteria, I would be trying to do it on a fortnightly basis to try to get the information to see whether or not you can actually get into the JobKeeper scheme.
Mm-hmm. Now, Guy, I've got a few more questions that have come through this morning, but just before we get to those, what are some of the most common traps that you've seen with JobKeeper?
I think probably the biggest one at the moment is working out what is involved in the GST current GST turnover and projected GST turnover. I think now with some of the information that's come through from the Commissioner on Monday, it's probably actually broadened those numbers and given more assistance out there. So whilst I still think it's a trap, then I think also too is an opportunity to revisit where you think you might not have been able to get into. I think one of the issues is we keep talking about turnover, but there's been a lot of people out there that are having to provide refunds or discounts or credits about things that happened in the past. You can only look at those on a case-by-case basis on how they actually interact with whether or not there is an impact on GST turnover. Long-term casual, certainly from the perspective of the hospitality area, is even though people might have had them for more than 12 months, whether or not they've been operated on with a regular or systematic basis. I know for one client we did a lot of work. There was multiple spreadsheets and pivot tables and pivot charts and everything like that, and depending on who was looking at it, there was a difference of opinion whether or not someone was regular or systematic, so be mindful there. And other ones, acquisition of businesses at the moment is an issue. people are still looking at buying businesses out there. And so the question is whether or not is if you're actually acquiring, if a shareholder if you're acquiring a company which is already operating, well, then you're effectively taking how they're dealing with the JobKeeper. But if you're setting up a new company and then buying a business which is so far getting the JobKeeper scheme, there could be a real risk of not being able to have the JobKeeper because the new entity wasn't trading first of March. Whilst the long-term casuals, there's some consideration in the legislation of that sort of continuing of tenure. It's not really that same part of legislation there, so I'd be very careful when you're doing your due diligence in acquiring a company. And also schemes. I mean, there's always schemes out there with regards to it. Now, certain schemes have, and the companion guide that the ATO released on the 1st have gone through a number of areas where they thought that certainly there'd be ones that have high risk for them to review. Other ones would be highly unlikely and other ones would be low risk. So I'd be very mindful of how you're actually getting into the JobKeeper. But there are clearly some times where decisions have to be made which are a part of course because of COVID-19, and I would be just reviewing that companion guide to make sure that it's an area of low risk. And finally, make sure your information's up to date and you've got the necessary evidence if the commissioner does come calling.
Mm-hmm. Guy, this is a question that came through from a HLB manager client this morning. If an employee is stood down and is paid accrued leave, should leave be reversed if they are eligible for the JobKeeper payment?
That's that sort of question's been going around, whether or not it's annual leave or long service leave. I think there's a discussion, again, we have to look at, with the Fair Work Act and see how that was dealt with in the first instance, and assuming that was done correctly, then that's okay. I think that's a conversation to have with the employee. So long as that $1,500 is seen to have been paid, before tax is seen to have been paid, whether or not it's been done via annual leave or long service leave, there's probably an opportunity to reverse that, because it would certainly be or giving back that part of the annual leave, because it's a benefit to the staff members. But I think with that one there, I would be discussing that first with the staff members to see how that operates in the first instance. But I don't see there being an issue. I think it goes back to the details on how that annual leave is reversed. I think it's the sort of the critical part to that.
Yep. Okay. Another question. Does the calculated income include invoices sent out but not yet paid for? Okay.
Again, this reverts back to the GST turnover and also to what's happening with the new compliance ruling, the draft compliance ruling. If this question was asked a few weeks ago, I would have been saying, okay, well, if you're on accruals basis for GST purposes, then I would have thought, well, the invoice that's been sent and it's been unpaid would be included. And if you're on a cash basis, I would have said, well, if it hasn't been paid, well, it's not included. That's what I would have said a couple of weeks ago. Now I would say, well, it could be a multitude of issues, and it could be included in different times, and what those times are going to be depending on whether or not how the supplier was actually dealt with in the first instance, or does it fit within one of the areas where the ATO has given some easier ways to get into it. So, it can be your attribution for a GST perspective, which is what I've just talked about, or it could be under accounting standards. So when it comes to that, it may be or maybe not. So I would take every opportunity to work through all the machinations of the law and the ruling, and see if you can get into JobKeeper by doing that. But it's not the same for everybody.
Okay. Guy, we've got a couple of questions that have come through live this morning. The first one is, what should the communication to staff centre around requesting them to complete and sign the eligible employee forms if they earn more than $1,500 per fortnight and there is no direct financial benefit to them of doing so?
No direct financial benefit in doing so. So the way I've sort of reading that, hearing that question is that those people are actually, the employees are actually earning more than the $1,500 per fortnight in the first instance. I've got to admit, it's the first time I've heard that before, out of all the discussions we had for all the other clients. I would have thought that it'd be part of the overall discussion is to support the business. And hopefully this is not the way that's been framed up. I would like to think that it's a part of an overall conversation that the employer's having with the employees. And I think with that at the moment is that, you know, we've got to support the employees, but also too, we've got to have strong employers to continue. So I think in that instance there is that it's how that conversation's had, even though there might not be a direct benefit to the employees today. It may be a real benefit to them down the track, you know, making sure that the companies can still operate.
Okay. An additional live question. My casual employee earns about $1,500 per fortnight normally. Now that they are getting JobKeeper, I still want them to work their normal hours, but they seem reluctant to work their normal amount of hours. Do I still have to pay them JobKeeper if they refuse to work their normal hours, which they are paid to do?
I think there's two parts to that. I think that the first part, I think probably the main part there is Fair Work Act issue and how that's actually dealt with. And I think that's something that would need to be looked at in the first instance. In the second instance there is that, the payments have got to be made whether or not they're working or not, if you want to receive that JobKeeper payment. So I think in that one there, probably the more critical part is dealing with the employee and understanding why the employee doesn't, or why the casual doesn't want to work. And I think that's more the issue. But also too is that, you know, the other thing when we start hearing about casuals is the question is whether or not those are eligible casuals. They've been around for the 12 months, and also too that they've operating on a regular and systematic basis. But certainly when it comes to if they don't want to work, it's trying to understand why that's the case and trying to do what you can to bring them back on board. But I think it's more of a Fair Work Act and dealing with the employee from a JobKeeper perspective. So long as you paid them the $1,500 per fortnight before tax, well then you'll get the support from the government for that.
Okay. Just before we wrap up, we've got time for two more questions. This one is, we have processed our April pays. Can we make a separate payment for JobKeeper before the 8th of May, or do we have to reprocess our pays, including the JobKeeper?
That's a good question. The way I've been dealing with this at the moment is I would be doing a separate pay. If you've already done the pays, I would do the separate pay and be very specific about it. I think it's a good way to do it. Because then you've got that opportunity to be able to specifically show how much money you pay with regards to that, and it stands out. There's nothing worse than people changing pays, going back into systems from an accounting perspective. That's something we certainly do not like. And I think in this instance here, doing a separate pay would certainly be the best way to do it if you haven't already paid it. And I know of a number of clients and other people I associate with that are doing that exact same thing, certainly by the time for the 8th of May for the 2 April fortnights. And also too, just to take on that as well, is I know a number of entities at the moment are changing their pay runs where this is a critical part for their operations to a fortnight, and actually aligning their fortnights with the JobKeeper, just to try and make some of these things easier to deal with.
Okay. And our final question is from a not-for-profit. As an NFP, we offer salary packaging to our staff. Can staff choose to salary package JobKeeper payments?
I think the interesting part is when. And this is one of the things that really just come out. There was just this discussions with regards to salary sacrificing super and certain other salary sacrifice arrangements that are already in place. I think the question that I would pose, and I'll admit I'll have to take this offline. I'm more than happy to deal with it and send the information through, is that if
Okay, thanks, Guy. To our audience members, I'm about to launch just a very quick poll. If you would like somebody from the HLB Man Judd team to contact you if you have any additional questions. And I'll just give that another couple of seconds just for people to vote. That ends our morning this morning. Guy, Brandon, thank you very much for your time. There's certainly a lot to talk about with JobKeeper. So if anybody does have any additional questions, you can email those through to hlb@hlbwa.com.au. And until then, we will launch another webinar next week. So thank you very much. Thanks,
Great.
Guy.
Thanks very much, everybody. Thanks, Richard.
Thank you.
Have a great day.